This is a story about love and about the one thing that not even a god can undo. The Greeks told many tales of their gods falling in love with mortals, and most of them end in tragedy, but few are as gentle or as sad as the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus. Apollo was one of the greatest of all the gods, the god of the sun, of music, of poetry, of healing and prophecy, radiant and powerful beyond almost any other. And he loved a mortal youth named Hyacinthus, a young prince so dear to him that the god came down from Olympus again and again simply to spend time at his side. It was, by every account, a true and deep affection. And it ended in an instant, in a single terrible accident on an ordinary afternoon, an accident that the most powerful of gods, for all his healing arts, was utterly unable to undo. How does a god lose the one he loves? And what does even a god do with a grief he cannot fix? That is the question at the heart of this story. So tonight you'll hear the real tale of Hyacinthus, the beloved prince, the jealous wind, the fatal throw, and the flower that grew from a god's grief. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel alive, and tell me in the comments which myth you like next. Now settle in, and let's meet the prince a god could not save. Hyacinthus was a young prince of Sparta, that famous city in the south of Greece, and he was renowned throughout the land for his beauty. He was a youth in the bloom of his life, athletic, graceful, full of the easy vigor of the young, the kind of person who seems to shine a little brighter than everyone around him. In a world where physical beauty was prized as a sign of the gods' favor, Hyacinthus was considered one of the most beautiful young men alive. He loved the outdoor life, the training grounds and the open air, the sports and contests by which young Greek men tested and displayed their strength and skill. And his beauty did not go unnoticed by the powers above. The Greeks believed that the gods walked close to the world in those days and took a keen interest in its loveliest things, and a youth as radiant as Hyacinthus was always going to draw the attention of the divine. In his case, it drew the attention of one of the very greatest of the gods. Not a minor spirit or a passing deity, but Apollo himself, the bright god of the sun and music, one of the most powerful and revered of all the Olympians, came to love the young prince of Sparta. And when a god as great as Apollo loves a mortal, that mortal's life is changed forever, for better and, very often, for worse. Apollo's love for Hyacinthus was, by the standards of these stories, remarkably tender and genuine. This was not one of those tales of a god seizing what he wanted and vanishing. Apollo's affection for the young prince was deep and real, and he expressed it by doing something the gods rarely did. He set aside his divine business to simply be with the one he loved. The old poets describe how Apollo would leave his sacred shrines and his divine duties behind and come down to Sparta to spend his days with Hyacinthus, sharing in the young man's life. The radiant god of the sun followed the mortal prince through his ordinary pleasures, walking the hills with him, fishing and hunting at his side, learning the country paths, content to be a companion rather than a lord. For the god who was worshipped across the whole Greek world, this was a kind of devotion that spoke of true love. The two of them spent long, happy days together in the Spartan countryside, the immortal and the mortal, bound by genuine affection. It was about as close to a happy story as the love between a god and a mortal ever came in Greek myth. But there was a shadow over it, a third figure, watching the two of them with growing jealousy. For Apollo was not the only one who loved Hyacinthus. The other admirer was Zephyrus, the god of the west wind, the gentle wind of spring, who also, the old stories say, had fallen in love with the beautiful prince of Sparta. But where Apollo's love was returned, Zephyrus's was not. Hyacinthus had given his affection to Apollo, the radiant sun god, and had no interest in the wind. And Zephyrus, watching the mortal he desired spend his happy days laughing and hunting at the side of his divine rival, was consumed with a bitter, festering jealousy. He could not bear to see Apollo and Hyacinthus together. He could not bear that the prince had chosen the sun god over him. And that jealousy, the Greeks tell us, would turn an innocent afternoon of sport into a tragedy. For Zephyrus, as the wind, had a terrible power that the lovers did not think to guard against. He was the very air around them. He was everywhere and nowhere. He could move unseen, and he could, at the crucial moment, give a sudden, fatal push to anything moving through the sky. The stage was set, though Apollo and Hyacinthus did not know it. On a fine day, the god and the prince went out together to one of their favorite pastimes, the throwing of the discus, a test of strength and skill. And the jealous wind was watching and waiting. The discus was a favorite sport of the Greeks, a heavy disc of stone or bronze that athletes would hurl as far as they could, a contest of strength and grace and skill. And on that bright afternoon, Apollo and Hyacinthus took turns throwing it in friendly competition, enjoying the simple pleasure of the game together in the open air. It was exactly the kind of ordinary happy moment that made their companionship so precious, a god and a mortal at play, with no thought of danger. Apollo, with his divine strength, took the discus and hurled it. It flew high and far, a tremendous throw, arcing up into the sky and sailing through the air. And Hyacinthus, young and eager, full of the excitement of the game, ran forward to where it would land, wanting to catch it or to make his own throw in return, watching the discus as it came down out of the sky. It should have been nothing, a discus landing, a young man retrieving it, the game going on. The two of them had surely done this 100 times before. There was no reason at all for anything to go wrong. But the god of the west wind was there in the air, unseen, jealous, and waiting for exactly this moment. And as the discus came down toward the running prince, Zephyrus struck. With a sudden vicious gust, the jealous wind caught the falling discus and drove it off its course, or, in some tellings, snatched it up and hurled it down so that instead of landing harmlessly on the ground, it struck Hyacinthus a terrible blow. The heavy disc hit the young prince, and he fell. It happened in an instant, in the middle of a happy game, on a perfect afternoon. One moment Hyacinthus was running, laughing, alive, and the next he lay stricken on the ground, brought down by the very discus his beloved had thrown. Apollo rushed to him in horror. The god, who had been laughing with him only moments before, gathered the fallen prince up and saw at once how grave it was. And here we come to the heart of the story, the detail that makes it so quietly devastating. Apollo was not just any god. He was, among his many powers, the god of healing, the divine patron of medicine, the father of the art of healing itself, the one to whom mortals prayed when they were sick or hurt. If anyone in all the cosmos had the power to save a dying mortal, it was Apollo. And he tried. The old stories say he used every art he knew, every healing skill at his divine command, desperate to save the young man dying in his arms. And none of it was enough. For there is one limit that even the greatest gods cannot cross, and the Greeks understood it well. The gods could do almost anything, but they could not undo death. When a mortal's time has truly come, not even the god of healing himself can call them back. Apollo, for all his power, for all his desperate skill, could not save Hyacinthus. The young prince he loved died there in his arms, on the grass of the playing field, on what had been one more happy afternoon, and the radiant god of the sun was left holding the body of his beloved, utterly helpless, undone by a grief that all his divine power could do nothing to fix. It is a strange and moving thing to imagine one of the mightiest of the gods brought low by ordinary heartbreak, kneeling on the ground, cradling a lost mortal, unable to do the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world. The Greeks, who usually showed their gods as remote and untouchable, here let one of the greatest of them grieve exactly as a human being grieves, completely, brokenly, and without remedy. Apollo could not bring Hyacinthus back. But he was a god, and there was one thing still in his power, not to undo the death, but to make sure that his beloved would never be forgotten, that something beautiful and lasting would grow out of the loss. As Apollo knelt over the fallen prince, grieving, the old poets say that from the blood of Hyacinthus, where it touched the earth, a flower began to grow, a beautiful blossom that had never existed before, springing up from the very ground where the young man had died. Apollo himself caused it, or his grief did, a living memorial to the one he had lost. The flower was named for the prince, the hyacinth, and it has carried his name ever since. And there was one more detail, the kind the Greeks loved. On the petals of the flower, it was said, you could see markings that looked like letters, the shape of a cry of grief, the sound a mourner makes, written by Apollo himself into the very petals so that the flower would forever mourn the boy along with him. The god could not keep Hyacinthus alive, but he could write his sorrow into a flower that would bloom again every spring, for as long as the world lasted, carrying the prince's name and the god's grief down through all the ages. And so something tender survived the tragedy. Every year, when the hyacinth blooms, it is, in the Greek imagination, the memory of a beloved young man returning with the spring, and the grief of a god, made beautiful and made to last. The story of Hyacinthus is one of the gentlest in all of Greek mythology, and also one of the most quietly profound because of what it dares to say about the gods. We tend to think of the Greek gods as all-powerful, and in most things, they were. They could level cities, change the seasons, turn people into beasts and stones and stars. But the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus draws a single, firm line, and it places that line exactly where we feel it most, at death and at grief. The god of healing could not heal this. The most radiant of the Olympians could not save the one he loved, and could not undo the loss, and was left to grieve as helplessly as any mortal who has ever lost someone. There is a strange comfort in that, even now. It says that grief is not a weakness or failure, that it comes even to the gods, that even infinite power offers no shield against the pain of losing someone you love. And it says, too, that there is something we can do with that grief, even when we cannot fix what caused it, we can make it into something that lasts. Apollo could not keep Hyacinthus, but he made a flower that blooms every spring and carries the name and remembers. We do the same in our smaller ways every time we keep someone alive in memory and in love. That, the story gently suggests, is the one power we truly share with the gods, not the power to defeat death, but the power to make sure that what we have lost is not forgotten. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.